Welcome back, everyone. It's awesome to have you here for another deep dive. Today, we're unpacking some fresh data from July 31st, 2026, and we're exploring a seriously fascinating theme that connects everything from your smartphone to global shipping and even the air we breathe. We're looking closely at the intense collision course between our rapidly expanding digital demand and the very real physical limits of our planet. So, I want to pose this question directly to you right out of the gate. What happens when our limitless digital ambitions actually collide with our physical world? Think about it for a second. We tend to treat the cloud, AI, global commerce almost like they're infinite, right? Like they're these boundless virtual appetites that can just scale up endlessly. But what actually happens when those virtual appetites slam right into the Earth's tangible, hard boundaries? Well, that is exactly what the data is showing us today. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's the roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at big tech's physical limits. Second, securing global supply lines. Third, climate crisis and carbon sinks. And fourth, emerging public health threats.
Starting right off with Section 1, Big Tech's Physical Limits. Right now, tech giants are literally slamming into the ceiling of physical reality. AI demand is exploding, absolutely skyrocketing. But, you can't just code more server capacity out of thin air. You actually have to build it in the real world. Just look at this staggering number, $220 billion. That's Amazon's newly raised capital spending plan. Why are they dropping that kind of cash? Well, because current computing capacity is just fundamentally insufficient to meet customer demand for AI. They desperately need to build the physical data centers, they need to secure the custom chips, and they need to generate the massive electricity required to make all this digital magic actually happen.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer juxtaposition of these two financial realities. Amazon Web Services is seeing a massive 37% revenue increase, accelerating to over $42 billion. That's huge. But at the exact same time, look at the cost of the physical infrastructure required to support that growth. Amazon's trailing 12-month free cash flow has actually turned negative. They're burning through roughly $7.6 billion. So the digital growth is incredible, sure, but financing the physical reality of AI, it is incredibly expensive.
And it's not just Amazon hitting this wall. Take Apple. They just reported a phenomenal 16.4% increase in revenue, with iPhone sales hitting a record $54.25 billion. Yet they're out there warning of a weaker forecast for the September quarter. Why? Because they literally cannot physically secure enough advanced processors and memory. Their digital sales ambitions are being hard-capped by physical availability.
Which brings us to Section 2, securing global supply lines. So, if the tech world is bottlenecked by physical chips, how do those components, and the energy required to power them, for that matter, actually get around the world? Well, they rely on global shipping routes, which are currently facing severe physical and geopolitical constraints. Right now, there's a Saudi-led multinational maritime coalition, formerly supported by 14 countries out of the 43 initial attendees, operating specifically to protect shipping routes through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. They're responding to ongoing Houthi threats that have severely limited passage through critical physical choke points like the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
But waiting around for military protection isn't the only strategy here. Take a look at this figure, $590 million. That's how much the energy giant ADNOC just spent to essentially bypass all this uncertainty. They went out and purchased 5 very large crude carriers to take matters completely into their own hands.
So the crucial point we need to take away here is this. ADNOC's massive purchase perfectly illustrates the extreme premium companies are now placing on physical control in a highly unstable world. They're building out a logistics division that now manages over 900 vessels just to ensure they have direct control over their regional transportation. When the physical world gets chaotic, taking direct physical ownership of your supply lines is basically the ultimate defense.
Let's move on to Section 3, Climate Crises and Carbon Sinks.
We need to shift our focus to the ultimate physical limit, which is, of course, our environment. While we're out here and building massive data centers and routing tankers around the globe, recent events are violently altering the fundamental makeup of our planet's atmosphere. This is a deeply sobering metric right here, 42,000 hectares. That is the sheer amount of pine forests completely destroyed by the Landes wildfire just west of Bordeaux, France. Scientists point out this was fueled by a really cruel weather combination. Basically, a very wet winter that encouraged rapid vegetation growth, immediately followed by a brutally hot, dry summer that turned all that new green growth into highly combustible fuel.
Let's just define this concept clearly for a second, because it's absolutely vital to understanding the big picture. A carbon sink is a natural environment, like a forest, that naturally absorbs and stores carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Forests are quite literally some of our best carbon sinks. But when these forests burn, it doesn't just destroy the trees, it violently reverses their entire function. Instead of capturing carbon, they end up releasing years and years of stored carbon back into the atmosphere all at once.
And let's look at how this builds into a much larger crisis. That reversal of our natural carbon sinks has led to this number, 18 million metric tons. That is the staggering amount of CO2 that European wildfires have released so far in 2026 alone. To put that into perspective, this marks France's absolute highest wildfire-related emissions in available monitoring data, which fundamentally weakens the long-term environmental infrastructure of the entire continent.
And that brings us to our final part today, Section 4, Emerging Public Health Threats.
So, how do all these environmental and physical supply constraints actually affect us at the end of the day? Well, they crash directly into human health. We're seeing real-time consequences where physical infrastructure is failing to protect us. And this brilliantly illustrates how abstract environmental data translates into an immediate physical danger. Look at these PM 2.5 levels on the board. This measures dangerous microscopic pollution. During those fires, Bordeaux recorded concentrations well over 300 micrograms per cubic meter, and Limoges exceeded 400. For a bit of context, the European Union's recommended safety limit is far, far below these emergency readings. This kind of fine particulate matter directly enters the lungs and the bloodstream, massively increasing the risk of respiratory illness, cardiovascular disease, and strokes.
And because wildfire smoke is often way more toxic than ordinary urban pollution, it fundamentally changes how we have to live and work. Clean indoor air is no longer just a nice-to-have luxury, it's rapidly becoming a critical piece of preventive infrastructure. Providing physical indoor filtration and having appropriate respiratory masks on hand is now basically a baseline necessity for public safety during these increasingly common smoke events.
But, air quality isn't the only invisible shield that's failing us right now. Let's look at another critical form of preventative infrastructure, national MMR. That's measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination coverage in the U.S. It's actually fallen to approximately 92.5%. Now that creates a 7.5% unvaccinated gap. And I know 7.5% might sound small to some, but in epidemiology, that physical gap is more than wide enough for a really severe outbreak to take hold.
Because of that specific gap, the stark reality is this. The U.S. has recorded 2,318 measles cases this year. That is the highest annual total we've seen in 35 years. And 16 states currently have coverage sitting below 90%. So it turns out our physical health infrastructure, which is fundamentally driven by community immunity, is proving to be just as fragile and subject to constraints as our tech or our shipping infrastructures.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway of this explainer. I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. If our digital ambitions, our global supply chains, and our daily health all rely so heavily on a fragile physical world, how do we build true resilience? The data we've looked at today clearly proves that you just cannot digitize your way out of physical limits. I'd highly encourage you to look around at the physical realities powering your own daily life and ask yourself how secure they really are. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack all of this today, and I'll catch you on the next one.